My name is Dean Georgaris. I'm the writer of Tristan and Isolde. When I would go to movies as a kid, the 20th Century Fox logo was always my favorite. It was kind of nice to see it in front of a movie I'd worked on. I originally wrote the screenplay to be a writing sample. At the time, Hollywood wasn't too big on the idea of buying or making romantic epics, especially set in the Dark Ages with a bunch of non-movie star roles. But I got lucky that when I finished the screenplay and my agent sent it to a few people to get opinions, one of those people was an executive at Ridley Scott's company named Jennifer Leshnick, who called me and said, "Did you know Ridley Scott has wanted to do Tristan and Isolde ever since he started making film?" And I said, "Well, of course I knew that. I wrote this for him." No, which was a total lie. But I mean, it was probably one of the better phone calls I've ever gotten in my life, because Ridley was and is one of those filmmakers that I think everyone gets into film to work with. And so to get to work with him on something I had written for pleasure was really an amazing opportunity. That first draft of the screenplay didn't begin with Tristan as a young man. It actually began with Isolde as an old woman, telling the story of what happened to them as lovers. It was meant to be something like you see in the film Amadeus, where throughout the movie you would cut back to her and this priest having a dialogue about whether or not this love affair was a noble thing or a sin. And sort of the idea being that by the end of the movie, she's essentially convinced the priest that this love affair, and in fact all love, is a noble thing. And when Ridley came on board, one of the first things to go was that notion of cutting back and forth through time, which part of me wishes we kept it, and another part of me likes it the way it is now. When when we decided to write Tristan as a young man, one of the first things I wrote was him walking through a field of sort of golden barley, feeling it with his hands. And then about 6 months later, I went and saw Gladiator, and I went back and rewrote that because I realized that it had already been done. One of the tricky things in writing this movie was really sort of getting through the first 20 to 30 minutes of story. And in some ways, I think it's probably the weakest part of the storytelling. And it's simply that there's so much story to tell. You have to introduce young Tristan, and in this case, I wanted to show, that there was a romantic side to him that sort of came from his father, and hence the little gesture of making something for his mother, which plays out later when he makes something for Isolde. But in a very short amount of time, I wanted to show that this dream of a united England was really the dream of his father, Aragon. And so when his father's murdered and his mother's murdered, one gets the sense that Tristan is going to sort of devote his life to making this dream come true. Political sequences like this one are the kind of thing you rewrite over and over and over again, because it's hard to remember what it's like to hear this information for the first time. And so initially you write it and you think it's pretty clever, but then someone reads it and has no idea what's going on. So you sit back and you change it and you change it, and it's this trade-off between making it convey the information without making it sound like you are conveying the information. Because the movie's budget was somewhat limited, this upcoming action sequence was one of the sort of sacrificial lambs. Once the Irish attack, originally I had Tristan be witness to an entire massacre and melee, but we didn't have enough money to film that, so I came up with the idea to throw him in the little trapdoor. Another thing that had to happen in this sequence was Lord Mark's character, played by Rufus Sewell, had to demonstrate that he was the most sort of noble of the men to lead the kingdom, because when Tristan's adopted by him and when Tristan takes up his father's goal of uniting the country, if the audience doesn't believe that Lord Mark is the right person to rule England, then sort of implicitly Tristan's a bit of a fool. So it was really important that Rufus say something sort of strong and dramatic and at the same time human. In one of the sort of more barbaric moments in the screenplay, after the Irish come in and slaughter most of the men and most of the women, I had a sequence where Tristan actually tries to drag his mother or father out of the castle. Even though they're dead, he's not sure they're dead, and he tries to drag them out of the castle as it burns down. But I don't know if this was sacrificed for rating or for content. I mean, one of the challenges with battle sequences like this is, when you write them, you want to write them really colorfully and really sort of so that they stick in the reader's mind and so that they evoke a feeling. And a lot of times you do that by describing pretty graphic violence, and then when you go to film it, depending on what you want the rating to be, a lot of your sort of favorite violent moments disappear. When I made the concession to the budget to put Tristan in the trapdoor, I believe at the time I wrote that, shortly thereafter a movie came out about Joan of Arc that Luc Besson did, and in the beginning I think a similar thing happens, in that I think young Joan ends up in a trapdoor when there's a massacre. And I remember I went to the movie and I saw that and I thought, oh, here we go again, but luckily they didn't make me change it this time. It's funny, one of the things that happens when you write things and you imagine them in your mind, you get a sense of kids and how old you think they are, and then you see them on the screen and they just look so much younger than you think they would be. I know when I saw this movie, I was amazed at how young this boy looked, even though that is the age he would be. Mark saving him and losing his right hand was, we did that in the second draft once I'd gotten rid of the notion of an older Isolde, and it was a nice touch because, I mean, sort of for the obvious metaphor of losing his right hand and Tristan becoming that right hand, but also because in a tiny little way, the saving of Tristan has permanently scarred Mark and left him to be less of a man than he was. One of the advantages of changing the story and starting with them as kids was we got to show Tristan as a boy and then Isolde as a girl. And with the idea of setting up, you follow both of their stories and you get a sense that somehow they're fated to collide.
She's with the gods now, Isolde. You'll see her again someday.
At one point, this was a much longer sequence. I think after the funeral, the Irish king made Isolde stay and basically greet all of the people to show that he was even then using the fact that she was his daughter and someone that the people liked for his political benefit, something that he does throughout the story. But again, I'm not sure if they didn't shoot that or if that was just cut. As I said, I think the entire first 15 or 20 minutes, there's so much to tell an audience, and you want to get through it and get to Tristan and Isolde being together, because that's ultimately what the story's about.
Why did she die, Brenda? Why?
The other parallel here being that Tristan has lost both his parents, and Isolde has lost really her one parent, because clearly there's no particular love between her and her father. Transitions like this generally you don't write in screenplay. I actually had never seen this until I saw the movie for the first time. Another one of the things that sort of gradually shrunk and then disappeared was how much time we would spend with Tristan as a boy here in the sort of ruined kingdom of Cornwall. When I was writing it, I took a lot of time here, probably twice what ends up on the screen, because I felt it was really important to show just how deeply rooted Tristan's desire to build this kingdom and to unite the country was. I think it's one of those things you fall in love with as a writer because you think it's really important, and then the reality of storytelling sinks in and you realize that what reads great for 7 minutes of screenplay, when you film it, frankly starts to become boring, or you can accomplish in 1 or 2 shots in 1 or 2 moments. The other really important moment for me in this sequence was Mark's reaction to coming home to his kingdom, seeing the devastation, having just lost his wife, and now seeing that he lost most of his kingdom and a lot of good people because of his attempt to unite the kingdom. And his response is that we rebuild, which I think tells you again a lot about what kind of man this is and why he's the one everyone chose to follow. And this is the sort of the third example of that. In general, you try to put in 3 examples of anything in a movie, and so here he is trying to learn to fight with the left hand and falling down and literally picking himself back up. Sometimes when you write something, you think it's going to work really well, and then you see it on screen and you're not sure you were right about it. And I think this moment may be one of those, simply because there's something about watching little boys fight each other that it didn't quite have the impact I thought it would. And I don't know if it's because I envisioned him being older, even though I didn't write him as older, or if it's just because sometimes, when you actually see it, it doesn't do what you thought it would do. But I thought him snapping and suddenly fighting would have more of an impact than I feel like it does. The other 4 or 5 minutes of storytelling that were taken out there were mostly devoted to the young boys talking about what they wanted to do and what they wanted to be. And you hear even back at that point Tristan talking about uniting the kingdom and defeating the Irish, and I think at one point even repeating words that his father had said. But like I said, you write all of that and then you watch it and you realize that the pacing of it is just too slow, frankly. The Roman tunnel here and the getting into the castle was a very, very late addition. I actually think it happened, I think the director Kevin Reynolds did it when I was off working on another movie, because this film was shot 7 years after I first wrote it. And Kevin was confronted with how was Tristan going to get into the castle in the end of the movie, and came up with this notion of an old Roman tunnel. And then if you know you're going to use it at the end of the movie, of course you have to go and set it up in the beginning of the movie. This is one of a few sequences that I actually didn't write and never saw until I saw the film. I mean, the idea that a writer writes a movie and it's filmed exactly as he or she sees it, and every scene and every line of dialogue is in the movie, is just completely a myth. Unless you write and direct it yourself, and even then, I think the odds of it turning out how you expect are probably 1 in a million.
Your armies to victories far and near. I've made you rich and powerful.
Yes, you have. You have been most loyal.
When I returned from Cornwall, I was hoping.
What would please you?
A wife.
I think this is another one of these moments that you think is going to work a certain way, and then you see it on screen, and it doesn't quite have the impact that you think it will. There was, I think, some notion in trying to continue Isolde looking off to the horizon and Tristan sort of thinking about Ireland and Isolde's thinking about England to get a sense that they were going to end up together. But often what happens is you film it, and then when you edit the movie together, you change the order of one or two little sequences, and then suddenly moments like that don't work quite as well.
So I have no say in my own life.
You have a duty to your king.
You are my father.
Then obey me.
Right from the outset, made the decision that the one character who was going to just be consistently brilliant and mean throughout the movie would be the Irish king. You know, he's an unsentimental man who sees his daughter very much as a tool to be used to keep his kingdom together.
And you welcome her?
I accept it.
This is another sequence that wasn't in the original screenplay.
How so?
I too dabble in elixirs.
We put it in when we decided that it seemed too coincidental that Isolde would be able to heal Tristan without knowing what the poison would be. Although, interestingly, I don't know that that's true. I think it probably would have worked without it. But it is a nice little moment to make you really hate the character of Morholt, who I think, I mean, you kind of hate him just by looking at him, the way they've sort of put him in costume and put him together. Every now and then, as a writer, you'll see something you didn't do that you like and you love, and you take credit for it. No, you don't actually take credit for it, but you want to. And then every now and then you'll see something that you just don't like that much. And I have to say, personally, the moment where Morholt is talking about herbs as sort of sexual aids and making a hard man harder is probably my least favorite moment in the movie. But it's good to, you know, sort of rev the audience up to really hate the guy in case they don't already. You know, one of the realities of going and actually making the movie versus writing the movie is, you know, how much money you have to spend on sets and visuals. And I think this is an example of a sequence that certainly when I was writing the screenplay alone for fun, you know, I sort of saw as a very big epic sequence of soldiers coming in and pulling people out of homes and hanging people, and you know, there were hundreds of people, and it was a whole epic scene. And I think actually the director Kevin Reynolds did a great job of capturing that with, you know, if you look carefully, sort of a fairly small group of people and a fairly small group of visuals. But the whole sort of look, dirty, dark, unclean, you know, no bright and shiny armor. That all really came from Ridley Scott. When we first sat down, you know, he said, I want to make this realistic. I want to make this Dark Ages as opposed to sort of shiny armor and, you know, King Arthur and Lancelot. And you know, there was no armor in the 5th century, so there's no real armor in this movie.
When would you strike?
At once. Throw everything we have at them.
They're hoping you'll do that. On horse, they outnumber us 2 to 1. You'll lead the men straight to their death.
So we do nothing.
This sequence was in the screenplay right from the beginning. It evolved slightly, but it was always, the idea was always to show the difference between Mark as a sort of strategic thinker and why he's actually a better king, and Tristan as the sort of natural leader. Now, he is the person that everyone follows. If he says he can win the fight, people believe him. And Mark knows that, and Mark uses that. You know, we didn't want to make Tristan so strong and so well-spoken and so perfect at everything that, You thought, who needs Mark? Really wanted to create a relationship between the two men, because that's ultimately what Tristan betrays.
Mark delivered me from that palace when I was a boy. He ran. So you can understand, when I think of kings, I think of him.
When I set out to write the screenplay, and I realized I needed the political story to be relatively easy to follow, one of the things I realized I had to create was an English noble who was so hungry for power himself that he would eventually ally with the Irish. And in the first draft of the screenplay, that character is named Gerard. I think it was Ridley who pointed out to me that that would be probably not the right name for the character, and hence Wictred was born. This is another case of a sequence where Ridley and Kevin Reynolds sort of greatly influenced both the look and the design. Originally in the screenplay, this was a massive sequence, just absolutely massive, involving Tristan and probably 50 or 60 Englishmen against 50 or 60 Irish on a sloping green field, and Tristan sort of outflanking them the way Hannibal did. And that clearly, one, that we didn't have the money to do that, and two, frankly, sometimes those sequences, I think, start to feel a little generic. Hence this sequence was born, where you create a trap for the Irish. And we also made the decision not to let the audience know exactly what was going on. And as a writer, sometimes you want to let the audience know ahead of time, and other times you want to let them play catch up. And this was a choice of catch up. In the screenplay, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to distinguish Tristan as a fighter. And it's another example of something you do that you think on the page is going to be really important, and then when you actually go film it, you realize that just seeing that he's a better fighter than everybody is probably enough for the audience to realize he's a better fighter than everyone. But the sort of skill we decided to give Tristan was speed. It's the reason why he kills the rabbit right at the beginning of the movie, is because he's sort of the quickest and the most agile. And it's ultimately how he defeats Morholt. And in the battle sequence here, all of the things he does mostly win by speed. This is one of those sequences that I think really, it disguises the fact that this movie was made with a fairly limited set of resources. I mean, this just feels to me like a big epic fight. Most versions of the legend of Tristan and Isolde have a love potion and all sorts of other magical moments. The closest thing to magic I have in this movie would be the poison on Morholt's sword. Right from the beginning, when I was writing the movie, I became attached to this notion of Tristan being killed, or seemingly killed, and set to sea. And the only way to do that would be to poison him, hence setting up that Morholt has poison on his sword, and then getting Morholt and Tristan into battle. Most of the time with battle sequences like these, you write them out, you choreograph them a lot as a writer, and then you get to the location and it completely changes, because the reality of production is just really different than sitting alone in your room. The character of Simon in the screenplay was more significant than he ended up being in the film. He was actually the third of sort of the three boys. There was Tristan, there was Malot, as I called him, or Malo as they call him in the film, and Simon. It was sort of almost like the little three friends who all talk about one day their dream coming true, and then the idea was Tristan and Simon would die in the sequence, basically, leaving just Malot. But as it is now, Simon just is killed in the sequence, and you pretty much don't know who he is. Sometimes you write something and you think it's going to have a great deal of impact, and then how it's filmed or acted just actually takes a bit of that away. I thought that this notion of a second boat, which is what Tristan says when he realizes he's been poisoned, would be sort of a dramatic moment, especially coming on the heels of Simon talking about the fact that he's dead and they're going to build a boat for him. But as it ended up in the film, I think it gets lost a little bit.
Tristan. He should have the king's service.
Story-wise, what was great about having Tristan essentially die was you also get to see just how deflating an effect that has on this sort of burgeoning English rebellion. I mean, in spite of someone like Malott wanting to keep the cause going, the fact that Tristan is gone, it lets all the air out of the balloon. I got this notion in my head when I was writing the first draft that they would set Tristan to sea and then burn his boat. I think I had read that that's what the Vikings did for their funerals, and so I locked in my mind that they would burn his boat and then somehow the rain would put it out, which again is one of those things that I think when you read it, you may get swept up and carried away in it, and in reality, had they shown it that way, it may have actually gotten an inadvertent laugh. So I think it's probably better to see it set to sea, a fire, and then the fire just goes out.
When the Irish came to Cornwall, and my father surrendered, you spared 12 out of 100. I am even less kind. The leader and 3 will take this message home. As for the rest,
I think we were incredibly lucky when we got Rufus Sewell to play Lord Mark. It was very important for the story for Lord Mark to be not only strong but likable, and I think in Rufus we found the perfect guy. I was always a fan of his. I remember when Kevin Reynolds called to tell me that we got him. I was over the moon. Kevin came on the movie very early, probably on the second draft, and was most familiar with his early films. One of his first films, Fandango, which also launched Kevin Costner's career, is one of my all-time favorite sort of 4 guys on the road movies. And I mean, one of the things Ridley pointed out when we got Kevin was he had the ability to sort of paint this really large canvas, an epic feel, without relying on hundreds of thousands of extras and millions of dollars of budget. I mean, he had done it on Rapa Nui. He had done it he'd made some of the biggest movies Hollywood had seen, so we knew he had the ability to sort of paint the bigger picture.
And live a loveless life like my mom. What's that? Where?
When you write a movie, at least when I write a movie, there are probably a dozen or so images that just stick in your mind right from the beginning that you sort of write to. And this was one of them. The notion of Isolde finding an overturned boat with a body inside it. Actually, in my mind, it had been on a sandbar out in the water.
It's a man.
Sophia Myles was an actress who I had never seen before when they cast her in the movie, and I just think she does an incredible job of sort of conveying Isolde's sense of independence without looking modern or feeling modern in any way. I mean, it's always a trick because, in period movies, the reality is women had no independence. But it was really important for the story for Isolde to sort of be ahead of her time, and I was worried about how that would actually look on screen.
Oh, quickly! His heart falters.
Sometimes when you write something, you don't even think of the most obvious sort of moment. And this is one of those moments that I can take absolutely no credit for, which is this notion of the women getting naked in order to warm Tristan. And I believe it's absolutely medically correct, and kind of wish I had thought of it. When I wrote the first draft, I actually didn't do a lot of research in general to the period. I read a lot of different versions of Tristan and Isolde, and then realized that the best thing to do would be sort of throw those out and take the best pieces and sort of tell the story I wanted to tell. I decided to set it in the 5th and 6th century. I spent about a week reading about how the Irish were in fact the most powerful nation at the time and how England was in disarray.
You're in Ireland.
And then you read about the technology that what do they have, what armor do they have, what armor don't they have, what things they're capable of.
It's all right. You're safe here. No one knows.
The sequence between Tristan and Isolde when they meet was probably one of the sequences that went through the most rewriting. And a lot of it was for pace and information. Decided early on that we wanted Tristan to be sick and delirious for at least the first portion of it.